Let's sing. Hide me now under your wings. Cover me within your mighty hand. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. The King over the flood, I will be still and know you are God. Find rest, my soul, in Christ alone. Know His power in quietness and trust. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the flood. I will be still and know you are God. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the flood. I will be still, know you are God. Hymn number 469. 469. Encamped along the hills of mighty Christian soldiers rise, and rest the battle at the mighty choke and the glory skies. Against the floating bells below, let our hearts sink behind. Faith is the victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory, oh glorious victory that overcomes the world. His banner over us is love, our sword the word of God. We tread the road the saints above, with shouts of triumph trod. By faith they like the world and swept onward every field. The faith by which they conquered death is still our shining shield. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory, oh glorious victory that overcomes the world. To him that overcomes the foe, our greatness shall be given. Before the angels he shall know, his name confessed in heaven. Then onward from the hills of light, our hearts with love aflame, will bear the shout of hosts and light. In Jesus conquering pain. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world.
Song after the lesson will be hymn number 904. 904.
What is the providence of God?
Look at best.
We're going through that tonight. If you had to explain it to somebody, how would you explain it? All of our blessings?
Root word provide.
Huh?
The root word is provide.
Root word is provide.
So he provides what we need for our salvation. And many times it might be our thoughts, kind of urged on by the Spirit through Scripture, or people that we run into, or we may be provided an opportunity to actually preach to someone else.
It's the word we use when we can't explain what happened.
The word we use when we can't explain what happened.
Well, providence means that he also has the authority to make things possible or impossible.
Yeah, he opens doors and closes doors.
Yeah.
I'm going to look at the book of Esther tonight. I've heard this definition that it's God's working indirectly in our lives versus directly. I don't like that definition. I've heard it called God working in a non-miraculous way within our lives. I don't like that definition. I don't know that he's working miracles, so to speak. But the truth of it is, what it comes down to is God intervening. I don't know any other way to describe it. And each of us, if we take time, and it might be like Ron said, we can't explain something. So we say, well, that's God's providence. And then other times we may recognize things. In fact, I had done this, and I looked on Facebook this afternoon, and I saw an event that I forgot about that happened 14 years ago. I had forgot about it happened. I didn't realize it was today. And it wasn't my event. Okay? When I went to preaching school, I got to meet a lot of people, and I became friends with a preacher at that time that was in Southwest Georgia, near where I grew up, a church that helped support me. So the next 2 years, we became very close friends. And when his wife were childless, and they had started trying to adopt. About a year after I got on preaching school, he called me and he goes, "Got something to talk to you about." And I knew that they were going to Florida to adopt a child that had been promised to them, a baby. And they got there, they had met with the mother a couple of months before, and they got to be going well. When they got there, it came to wanted to sign all the papers, and they walk into the adoption agency, and there are more than just their social worker there with them, several other people. And make the long story short, what it came down to is that mother had changed her mind. But there was a mother who had decided at the last moment she wanted to give up her child. She was born a month early. She had been contemplating whether or not to try to work it. The biological father was willing to sign off. And because, well, what happened to them, they were being given first dibs. And if they wanted that baby, they could have it. It'd be 2 days. And they actually told them, the one worker with them says, in all the 20 years I've been working here, this has never happened before. We've never had a baby pop up for an adopted couple right after another one backed out. John and I agreed, still agree. Everything that happened was through the providence of God. When all those things just fall in place too easily, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in the providence of God.
So I would say that God bringing His redemptive will without interfering with man's will, so in a lot of cases.
Through His will, He works, and He works for the good of us. Now, most of that is through our salvation, but sometimes we get so tied up in it. What about the salvation of this child? Let me share this with you. About a month ago, she was baptized. We have to ask, where would she be had not John adopted her? This is what we're talking about. You go into the life of Joseph, and you see some miraculous things happen and some non-miraculous things happen. You see him have these visions. These same visions are what makes his brothers hate him even more and cause them to sell him into slavery. Yet here are the Ishmaelites come along at the right time to buy him, take him down. He ends up in Potiphar's house. He ends up in prison. He ends up in front of Pharaoh. See, Esther has an interesting answer to it. Oh, that's pretty much what I'm going to have to change that. In chapter 4, verses 13 14, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You know the book of Esther, what you know is there's a man that hates Mordecai so bad, he wants to kill every single Jew on the earth. And he's got the king's approval to do it. And Mordecai's question is, how do you know that you're not queen for this very moment in time?
Those are the words she needed to hear.
They are the words she needed to hear. So we're going to take a little look at Esther's life, because it caused her to act in such a way. And Mordecai was right. God was going to deliver his people because they were the people for the Messiah to come through. Now, notice when Queen Vashti, whatever it is she refused to do for King Ahasuerus, was removed as queen, it was decided to find a new queen. In verse 2, 4 to 8, we read, then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, the Benjaminite. Why is all this important? I want you to think about this point. God showed us here how he already worked out for Esther to be there at the right time in the right place. No, Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. See, sometimes we think, well, God just made this happen. And sometimes it's been planned for years.
4 generations.
4 generations. He was working back then. See, what we forget is a lot of times providence is God having used his foreknowledge and knowing when to intervene. And notice that Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful when her father and mother died. They died, so she was an orphan. Just had this thought, kind of fitting that I brought up an orphan in the beginning. Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace and to the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now, when you read about Joseph, it'll tell us that God caused Joseph to find favor in the eyes of Potiphar. This doesn't say this, but it tells us of how Haggai liked Esther so much that he gave her an extra portion of the things that were supposed to make her beautiful and everything. He coached her on what to say when she was interviewed. She found grace in his eyes, as some would put it. Again, right place, right time. Notice, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. All this was work to make her queen. You know, when we ask the question, or when Mordecai asked the question, who's, well, now you were made queen just for this moment. You got to go back and look. How did she become queen?
Even Mordecai didn't know. That's the beauty of it.
Well, but he's saying suppose. He's thinking.
He is, but he's also saying with faith and trust, God's going to work it out. It may not be that you were chosen, but God's going to rescue people.
And his point is, if you sit silent,
do what you can.
you may be over there dying, whereas God will deliver the rest of us. There's that point there, and there's that point there when we think about things in our lives. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a movement by a lot of people to say that God was dead. They try to say God is dead. What they try to say is God no longer works in our lives. What did Nebuchadnezzar learn in Daniel chapter 4?
God's real.
God's real. A little more than that. One thing in particular. Huh? Grass is edible? It'll make you go mad. Or you have to go mad to eat it. Maybe you have mad cow disease.
That God most high gives kingdoms to whoever he feels like.
He raises them up, takes them down.
Ron said, God most high gives kingdom to whom he wills. He brings them up, he tears them down. Don't know if Mordecai knew the book of Daniel or not.
Those were the last two books they had to decide, that the rabbis had to decide whether to let them into the canon. So during that 400 years, in that 163 or so, those were the last two books that were added because it was the first time they'd seen them.
So it comes the point. I think Mordecai understood that God gives kingdom.
And Mordecai seems like a true believer.
In Daniel chapter 4,
It's clear that you recognize that God was working amongst you. In
yes,
his conversation with Esther, you see that.
right. Joey said it's clearly working. One thing I was going to make a point of, Daniel chapter 4 is actually written by Nebuchadnezzar. And he does make a proclamation that went out throughout his kingdom, making that statement. So, whether or not people read the book of Daniel, they may have known about that proclamation. But here it comes back to this point. All through it, we see Mordecai in his discussion looking to God, though he does not call him God, does not speak God. In fact, when, as Dwayne pointed out, Esther heard the word she needed to eat, she says, gather all the Jews and fast for 3 days. What went hand in hand with the Jews fasting like that? Prayer. Seeking God's counsel. That's the whole point of the fasting, was that it would be well with her. That's what she said, that it would be well with me when I call for the king. There is even making an appeal to God to intervene. And that's the point of it. If God's not active in our lives today, what's the point? How about the hurricane? Or hurricanes?
Look how many people were hurt physically.
Well, my point is, how many of us prayed during those hurricanes? What were we praying for?
To die down.
To go somewhere else?
No.
Let it go somewhere else? That it didn't hurt nobody this last one. I think we're more focused on that because God felt like somebody's gonna get it. Does it really make us right for say, please go out there and hit somebody else instead of me? I'm not sure that's necessarily the prayer we should have. But we're praying for intervention of some kind. And if you don't believe that God intervenes, why pray? In fact, if somebody tells them God doesn't intervene, I got a feeling they don't only pray in public. I don't think they have any private prayer. Because it's kind of what's the point?
I would go so far to say that probably a large percentage of our prayers are asking God to intervene in some way or another.
I would agree 100% with that, Don. In fact, I think the only time we're not praying for intervention, we're thanking Him for intervening. So intervention is included somewhere. You know, when's the last time you thank God for His blessings? Huh?
Every day.
Every day. Let me ask this, Donna, because spoke up. Joey kind of brought it up at the beginning. Where did the blessings come from? So what does that mean God had to do for you to have those blessings? He had to intervene.
Blessings can be no.
Blessings can be no. Blessings can be no. And honestly, God's providence can work two different ways.
And sometimes we have to look back to that and say, you know, it's a good thing God didn't answer that prayer.
Sometimes you would look back and say, God, I wish you'd said no. And I agree with Don. Sometimes we look back and we say, you know what? Thank you for not.
God did what he would do.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, he did.
Now, know that then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday of the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. When birds were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Seems kind of a weird footnote, don't it? I want you to understand, this is how the God works things out. Now Esther had not revealed her family or people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. So when he brought her in to go up, don't tell who you are. Don't tell them you're a Jew. Don't tell them you're related to me. You ever wonder who put that thought in Mordecai's head? What's the big deal? Especially once she became queen, what's the big deal about revealing who she is?
She still would have been in danger and had less.
This is before that happened.
And less influence. Yeah, but people still hated other people.
Well, I understand that, and I understand your point,
And the relationship would not
But-
come.
but let's take us a step further. If she's made queen and she reveals who she is, and much as from what we see, Ahasuerus loved her, I keep it a secret. Who's going to go after the queen? You know what? This ain't the preacher's wife. This ain't the president's wife or the governor's wife. It's not it's political, but it's not in a free society where the king can be removed.
Well, if her identity as a Jew had been known, would she ever become a queen?
Well, I'm saying after she became queen that she revealed. Let me put it like this one. There's three people in the story, three main people. One's Mordecai, one's Esther, and then there's Haman. And people like Haman. And I want you to think about this as we go through the rest of it. And that's not the only generation to ever hate the Jews. But what this did for them throughout the time of the Medo-Persian kingdom, in the end, protected them till the end of it. Now, it's an interesting thing here in Esther chapter 2, verse 21 through 23, and this is after Esther becomes king, but before Haman does any of his actions. It tells in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. What does that mean, sought to lay hands on him? They were going to kill him. They were going to assassinate him. So the matter became to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther. And Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed that both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Now, I want you to notice something here. If they killed Ahasuerus, what happens to Esther? She'll no longer be queen at the very least. What happens if Haman happens to rise up under another king to the near same authority that he has, and Esther's not in place? See, it is interesting. God let Mordecai find out what was about to happen. His concern is for his niece, his daughter, by his own accord. So he sends word to her, who in turn sends word to the king and tells him that she came about it through Mordecai's name. And it's put in the book of Chronicles. Then you jump to chapter 5, and this is after Haman hates Mordecai so much that he's got this decree where on a certain day, all throughout the kingdom of the Persians, anyone who hates any Jew can go and kill him. And the right to defend themselves is taken away. You know what would have happened if a Jew killed somebody trying to kill him on that day?
No.
The government would execute him. Dead either way. Now, so Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Why did Haman hate Mordecai so much? He wouldn't bow down to him. He wouldn't pay homage to him. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he went and called for his friends and his wife Teresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. You know, look how good I am. Look how I've been blessed. Look how everything has fallen before me. And he said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. How big of ego did Haman have? I think he saw himself as possibly being the next king. But notice, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. How big a gallows would that be?
Enough for everybody to see, no matter where.
Big enough for everybody to see. We generally say a cubit was probably equal to about 18 inches, so it would have been 75 feet tall. It wasn't needed to be that tall to hang Haman. It was needed to be that tall to make a public display, or not Haman, Mordecai, to make a public display of it. And notice how God turns that around. That night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Do you think there we go, very more Providence? Because you know God is the one. You ain't sleeping tonight.
Who read that?
I'm going to keep you awake. Then you're gonna call for this book to be read, and I'm gonna make sure they read from the right page.
Apparently there was some kind of time frame between this.
It would seem like it was, and so whereas sometimes we take those banquets as being one right after the other, there was a time of preparation for them in between, long enough for him to build a 75-foot gallows. Now, I don't know how many men he had building it or what his availability of the lumber or what have you was, but he got it done. It's built. On this particular night, it is built. Okay? So by this time frame, it's built.
Well, also the fact that the king apparently had forgotten what he had done to the eunuchs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so he had to have it read to him to remind him, hey, this is something that happened. So it hadn't happened, it wasn't like it happened this week, and he would have remembered it then, but he had to have it read to him to remind him that it had happened.
I read somewhere, and I don't know that the idea is that the book of Esther is actually 3 to 5 years of events, which wouldn't be that obscure. You know. Now, notice this. He cut in sleep. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? You know, here he is. This man saved my life. What did we do for that man? He saved my life. What did we do for him? And those who attended said, nothing's been done for him. Now, if you were a king or you're in that point, what would you want to do? I don't want to recognize it. I want to correct that. I want to make sure I did something for him.
And maybe find out who neglected to do it.
Maybe, but for our knowledge, God said we need to know that he wanted to take that, correct that. And here's another little bit of providence. So the king said, who's in the court? Notice, now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him.
And for what reason can you go to a king and all of a sudden say, I hate this man, would you hang him? I mean, seriously.
Well, and what he had told him was there was people that were against the king, and they defied all the laws of the king, and that's how he got his little decree passed to begin with, and paid money for it to be done. So his point is, he thinks he's got enough influence with the Ahasuerus that he can get this job done, and not have to wait for the day of his decree. So the king said, who is in the court? You have Haman there. Isn't that kind of an ironic thing? I think it's a little bit more providence, God. Haman, I'm going to work this through you. What is that saying? You'll reap what you sow. So the king said, who's in the court? As we read, the king's servant said to him, Haman is there standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now notice Haman's ego taking over. Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So what he tells the king is what Haman would want to be done to him. Now that's why I think Haman thought he should be king. Oh, I left that part out. So he goes through and he tells him a royal coat of purple that has been worn by the king should be put on the man. The man should be put on a horse that the king himself has ridden, that has the crest request of the king on its head, and that someone from the court should parade that man around and say, so will the king do to any man that he delights in. And Azariah said, go do that for Mordecai. Right then, I think he knew. I've got a lost cause here. When he went home, his family told him, if Mordecai started to rise in the eyes of the king, the thing that you're planning will lead to your downfall. Which it did. So at the time they were talking, it tells us that they came to get Haman to go to the banquet. It tells the king Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Think the king liked Esther?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
That statement was made by several rulers over the time that we read about half the kingdom.
And we hear that, but it was people that really found favor in it. It wasn't made lightly. Now notice, the Queen Esther answered and said, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. Don't you know at this point the Azariah said, what are you talking about? What do you mean your life and your people's life? And notice I said, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed and killed and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as a male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. But what she's pointing out here is that this person is not only trying to kill us, he's doing the king a disservice. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Don't you know Haman's already won't believe? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. If he hadn't figured out she was a Jew by then, he knew now. You see how God placed him right there. Put him right there where he was. Now, I want to think about this because we know the story. When the king goes out to think about this thing, what's going on, he realizes this is from Haman's decree. They had at that time, these couches that they lounge on, that they lie on and eat from. And here's Esther sitting on hers. And Haman realizes he's in trouble. And he leans over on that couch with her. Basically to beg for his life. And Ahasuerus walks in and sees that and says, is he so bold that he would assault the queen with me in the room? Because it was an act of assault for him to be on that couch with her. And the servant said, hey, at the same time they covered his head, they said, there's his gallows that he was going to hang Mordecai on. And guess who swung from that gallows that night? He went from there to the gallows. Something I probably read but never came to mind was that as you go through and read the rest of the book, all of Haman's property was given to Esther. And she placed Mordecai in charge of it. And then they went and fled before the king for their lives and the Jews. And the problem was in the Persian kingdom that once a decree had been signed with the king's signet, it could not be undone. So he gives his signet ring to Mordecai and to Esther and says, go and do what will save your people. That's the basic part of it. Paraphrase. So they wrote a decree that gave them the right to stand up to their enemies. And anyone that had tried to attack them and annihilate them, they would be able to destroy. Interesting point came up and said many people throughout the empire became Jews for fear of the Jews. That's what I'm saying about it. Preserve their lives. Even when Azarias died, that decree could not be undone. So their ability to defend themselves from people that hated them went on to the end of the Persian Empire. This is our last text. Now he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. If Haman had succeeded, what would have happened? Jews would have been destroyed. What would have happened if the Jews had been destroyed?
Christ would have came.
Christ would have came.
God's plan warned him, but it never was going to happen.
It never was going to happen. We know that. The devil thought he could make it happen. The devil was behind every instance of this. Just a reminder, God is always smarter than the devil. He knew how he would thwart this plan long before the devil ever made it. And that is what Romans 8 is trying to tell us. God searches the heart of man. He knows the hearts of men. And he will use his intervention to thwart the evil plans of men time and time again for the good of those who love the Lord. See, here's the thing. It was for our good that Esther was queen.
She was willing to sacrifice to die. Picture Christ.
Really, picture Christ. All that was being worked for our good. And not for ours, but for anyone that loves the Lord. See, that's the point that when people try to tell us that God doesn't intervene this way today, it makes me wonder, have you read the Bible? Do you understand the Bible? Have you really looked at it? I heard a young man on a lectureship a few years ago preaching about the providence of God and said, I can't ever see where it works. I'm like, why are you preaching on providence of God when you don't even know what it is? And can't see it acting in your own life?
That's probably the purpose of Esther. A lot of times in teaching, people, I guess outside of the church, and sometimes in the church, they're thinking miraculously, mysteriously. When God is very practical in the book of Esther, he's using people. He's using thinking people. He's using people that's going to sacrifice. And so that's very practical, even today with us. And so whenever teaching, I used to say, okay, let's take it to a practical level. because people don't understand something. So I think about it, and study on it, and bring it down to a practical level. Therefore, I can explain it, and it made sense. And people could understand it better.
And honestly, I would say if you can't see God working in your life, you need to examine your relationship. Give you one other instance of my life. 2014, we talked a lot about Jilly being a Navy shooter. Up in Chicago, basic training, about to graduate. I took my vacation. Decided I wanted to see some friends and family before I got up there. It was the week before Thanksgiving. This week. I went to my mother's first. Spent 2 days there. My stepdad and I were talking till about 10 o'clock at night, 10 or 11. He goes, "What time are you planning to leave in the morning?" I said, "Somewhere around 7 or 8. He said, "If I don't talk to you tomorrow, make sure you tell Jillian how proud we are of her." And this thought was, if you leave before we get up or we get going and we miss you, make sure you tell her how proud we are of her. The next morning, my mother, already bedridden in a separate bed, calls the house phone. I'm not answering. The answering kicks on, and she said, because I'm on the other end of the house, and says, "Alfred, I can't wake Jack up." I jumped up and ran in there, and he's on the floor dead. Had a heart attack during the night. I believe to this day it was the Providence God that I was there, that he died that day, and not after I left. Because they put these things under the door to keep anybody from breaking in. Nobody could even let anybody in. That's what he was normally doing, getting up so that the woman that came in to take care of her, he'd remove that from the door so she could get in. Now his brother lived about 300 yards away. He had the key to the house, but he couldn't have got in to that part. The ambulance got stuck coming through the gate. Bobby went down and got the gate opened up to where they could come on through. They had an electric gate. Bobby had opened it the first half again, but you know what happened the next day, what I was doing the next day, the very next day? Changing the battery on that gate because it wouldn't work anymore. The battery died. All those things. Somebody there, somebody able to open doors. I remember my sister saying, "I hate that it was you that found it." I told her, I said, "I hate it too, but I'm glad I was here." God works in our family. God works in our life. Another day and I would have been in Indiana.
Makes you wonder what God did to Mordecai to keep him from going back when Cyrus gave the decree to go back to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Mordecai stayed there.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing. Why didn't Mordecai stay? Why didn't Mordecai's family stay? God worked that somehow. Somehow, God worked through their carrying away that he was in Babylon to begin with. All that God worked. And if we understand something, there was one miraculous thing done other than his actual intervention. To me, it's kind of miraculous to begin with. That's why but no laws of nature broken, nothing of that sort. But he works. He works. He works in our lives. We just have to be willing to see it. We have to wake up. We have to open our eyes. He makes intercession for us. It's like Don made the point. Those prayers that he says no, as Don called unanswered, they're not unheard. They were answered no. But they were for our good.
Wouldn't that also answer for be an explanation to people that think that God only works through the word?
Yeah, you know, I know people who believe that only through the word, and I know a lot of what he does is through the word. He's not going to force somebody to change or anything, but at the same time, we need to realize sometimes we're put in a position to meet somebody, either to bring salvation to them or give them their opportunity to have salvation. Sometimes we don't think about that. And that's not the word doing that. We're doing it because of what the word has taught us. We're out there trying to seek people. But God causes us to meet people that we may have never met in any other circumstance, just to give them an opportunity. That's why it's important. God works through us all the time.
Scripture of angels run where?
Angels run. Sometimes we're the angel. The angel's just a messenger. And sometimes I think it might be a heavenly being steering us in another way.
But he doesn't work in mysterious ways. He never has. I understand what you're about to say, but he's always revealed his plan.
He's always revealed his plan. Sooner or later he reveals it, but at the same time, we don't always understand the workings of how he can do it.
But he's not mysterious.
But I understand what you're saying.
A lot of people say he works in mysterious ways. No, he doesn't. He never has.
Well,
On his own.
Scripture says he works
saying.
in mysterious ways.
Yeah, but I'm trying to be practical about it.
I understand, you're being practical, and I understand that. And though he reveals the answer to the mysteries, sometimes we don't always understand his working. And that's what that means. We don't always understand it, but it's there to see if we are willing to look. Now, we know that he had hid a lot from the devil through the Old Testament. After Christ rose, there was no more hidden. God does let him know, here's what I'm doing. No reason to hide it. Because if the devil had ever known that if Christ died would lead to the salvation of mankind, he'd have never killed him.
We are commanded to give the glory to God. And many times, if we don't give the glory to God, we can become pompous and puff up our ego when it really was God working that made it happen.
And that's what it comes down to. People have asked me sometimes, where'd you come up with that idea for that lesson? Now, sometimes I've sat there and said, and I'll be honest, a lot of them, I looked at what I need and I figure if I need it, somebody else can use it too. And then there's sometimes I've had a thought in my head that I don't know where it came from.
You get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to rewrite your sermon.
I get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and rewrite my sermon.
Done that. Anytime.
And the one I wrote was a whole lot better than the one I had. And I don't know if people know how many times the preacher prays for a sermon.
The preaching school, they tell you, read all you can, not just the Bible and other things. If there's tidbits, people might make a comment. You can make a sermon off that comment, just outside of these doors.
Yeah.
Anything, you can make it into a sermon.
I heard a sermon one time that had not one bit of scripture in it. And Only thing that I could take away from it was the one thing the guy said. God has always used water to separate his people from people in the world. I'm gonna let y'all think about that because I did write a sermon on it. And there's particular instances where he shows us where you use water to separate. So even that, I got something out of the sermon. We can get something out of any sermon if we're looking for it. And you're right, a lot of ideas, what people say, bring us ideas for sermons. Bring us ideas to what God is teaching. So, we got an invitation song.
904.
904. If there's anything we can do for anyone tonight, that's come on stand and on sing.
Have you been to Jesus Christ?
Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you walking daily by the Savior's side? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Will you rest each moment in the crucified? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? When the bridegroom cometh, will your robes be white, pure and white in the blood of the Lamb? Will your soul be ready for the mansions bright, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Lay aside the garments that are stained with sin, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb. There's no fountain flowing for the soul unclean, will be washed in the blood of the Lamb. Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
Does anyone need to partake of the Lord's Supper?
I have an announcement, a request I'd like to make before we dismiss. I'd like for you